some of the problems with Kant's view that we didn't get a chance to look at because I just talked for such a long time last class. So did you all have a chance to think about Kant's ethical theory and think about what you might disagree with it about? Did anybody see any glaring problems with it or questions that you had? Maybe it would be useful to go over again what Kant said makes an action moral or immoral. Now, he gave us a pretty technical analysis. He said that the morality of an action is determined by the principle that motivates that action, and then whether you do the action from duty, right? Just out of recognizing that it's the right thing to do. Put another way, it's based on the person's intention, right? If you have a good intention, then you did a good thing. Even if you didn't succeed at saving the person in the burning building or, saving the world from a deadly virus, if you had a good intention, then the action was good. Can anybody see any problems with this view or Kant's view generally? Yeah.
The problem I see essentially with that view is that one person could view, let's say, taking away food from a certain group of people, and he could view that as good because that certain group of people are judged as criminals, take food as criminals, I guess. And then since his intentions are good for the rest of society, according to Kant, that would be okay.
Right. So if we're going to follow Kant's more technical analysis, he'd say, well, you have to universalize the maxim. Is it universalizable? Then actions that flow from it are moral. But a more basic point is what you just brought up. Is somebody's intention enough to justify what they do? Or are there other factors that play into whether or not their action was moral or immoral? Like, say, the consequences, for example. Right? I think we all have an intuitive sense that what we do matters. Like, the consequences matter. Right? If I just run around intending to do good things and I blow up the world, does that make me a good person? We probably wouldn't think so. Right? So we have some sort of sense that maybe the consequences of our actions do matter. Whereas Kant says the consequences have nothing to do with it. The consequences could be X, Y, Z, doesn't matter. As long as your intention is good, you did a moral thing. But that doesn't always jive with our intuitions, right? Now, another question you might ask, which is a claim that Kant makes, is that morality is something that we can discover just purely through thinking about it rationally, by engaging in rational analysis. Is that true, though? Is morality primarily a rational thing, and can we figure out what morality is just by thinking about it? Just by analyzing it? It's not always clear, right? The world is kind of a gray place. So you might wonder, or you might question whether or not morality is what you might call a sub-field of rationality, which is what Kant believes. He thinks that you have rationality, and then morality is just a part of what's rational. But it's not clear that that's the case. Anything else about Kant's theory that makes it problematic or doesn't exactly fit with what you think makes an action moral or immoral? How about this? Kant makes a pretty strong claim about what makes an action moral or immoral. He says, if your desires or personal interests play any role in you doing the action, that cheapens it. Do you all agree with that? Say one of the reasons why you helped the old lady across the street was because you wanted to. You had a desire to do it. Does that cheapen helping her across the street? No. Right? Sometimes our intuitions in this area kind of prompt us to say, well, I don't think our desires or if we're doing the moral action out of self-interest makes it any less moral. Right? Now, maybe if our own self-interest or our own personal goals, if that's the primary reason why we're doing it, then okay, maybe it cheapens it. But Kant says even a hint of your action being motivated by a personal desire or a personal growth cheapens it by the same degree. It's a pretty strong claim, right? So I think we might have good reasons to question that or possibly disagree with it. And then there's the whole business of, do we really need to go through this convoluted universalizability analysis to figure out what the hell to do? Isn't it easier than that? Isn't it more intuitive? Do we really need to go through all those steps? Maybe not. As we'll see today, we're going to be talking about an ethical theory that I think is much more easily understood and in some sense, much more easily applied. Now, I'd like to say something before I jump into that, which I'm not sure I said during our first class meeting, but I just want to put it right out there. My goal in this class is not to tell you what to think, okay? Morality is difficult. And at the end of the day, you have to decide what you believe in and what you think is true. So I want you to look at this class not as me presenting to you what I think is an accurate picture of reality, but rather giving you a bunch of different tools or perspectives with which to look at morality. So just keep that in mind as we go through this unit and the rest of the units too. I'm giving you different perspectives. It's up to you to sort through them, to figure out what you think is true and why you think it's true. All right? Okay. Is there anything else y'all want to say about Kant's view? Any other problems you find with it? Or should we jump into utilitarianism? All right. Let's jump into utilitarianism. I had you read today an article by John Stuart Mill, who is one of the most influential philosophers of the 19th century. John Stuart Mill had his hands in a lot of different disciplines. He was a member of Parliament at one point. I believe he was the second member of Parliament to advocate for women's suffrage, which is cool. But he also studied physics. He had an extensive knowledge of ancient Greek and Latin. He had learned Greek by the time he was 3. I mean, what the heck is that? That's impressive. Well, what we're going to be looking at primarily today is his ethical theory. An ethical theory that he did not develop, but he did help popularize. The ethical theory that we're going to be looking at today is utilitarianism, which was actually formulated, I believe, by Jeremy Bentham, who is another philosopher, and who actually worked with Locke and tutored him in some instances. And we're going to be comparing this ethical theory with the other ethical theories that we're looking at in this unit. Although we'll do more of that stuff kind of later. I'd like to begin by just giving you some kind of general notes on what utilitarianism is, what it says, what Mill's goal is in this piece, and what he's doing. In order to understand this piece a little better, you have to understand where Mill is coming from as kind of a frustrated academic and somebody who wants to change the world for the better. He's looking out around Europe and the United States, and what he sees is obviously imperfect, right? There are people who are ruled by greed. There are bad things happening. There are people getting hurt. And at the same time, he's looking at the history of philosophy, and he's thinking, we've been discussing ethics, morality for thousands of years, and yet we still haven't figured it out. We haven't made much progress. His goal in this piece is to make an actual contribution to moral philosophy. Mill wants to set the record straight. He wants to explain to us what he thinks makes an action moral or immoral, and to actually advance the discussions around morality forward. He sees ethics, at least in academia, as being locked into a kind of stalemate. And he wants to do what he can to break that and to convince people that utilitarianism is the right way to do things. So he wants to make a contribution towards moral philosophy. He wants to explain what utilitarianism is and why it matters. And then also later in the article, which we're not going to talk about too much today, is his defense of utilitarianism from different objections. Common objections that he's heard that try to tear down this moral theory that he then rebuts in different ways. Now, Kant's theory of what makes an action moral or immoral was not the only ethical theory that was floating around at this time. Obviously, people think what makes an action moral or immoral varies in a wide range of instances, and everybody kind of has their own theory about what makes an action moral or immoral at the end of the day. But there were a few popular theories of his day that he actually contends with in this article that I think would be helpful to mention. The primary theory that he critiques here, besides Kant's, which again says that the intention of the person determines the morality of an action, the other theory that he critiques is known as moral sentimentalism. This was a moral theory that was popular at the time, that made a rather startling claim about how we know an action is moral or immoral. The people who developed this theory thought that, no, we don't know what's moral or immoral through rationality, through reason, like Kant says. There's something different going on. The moral sentimentalists argued that we actually have an innate moral sense, just like we have a sense of eyesight or a sense of smelling or a sense of touch. We have kind of this innate moral sense to just sense when something is moral or immoral. Now, it's not exactly like our eyesight. It's not exactly like our taste or our sense of smell. But it's kind of similar to it. And so in the opening pages of this article, John Stuart Mill critiques this view. He doesn't find this view convincing. Now, we're not actually going to go into this view in this class, but I think it's useful for you to know that this was floating around at the time and it was gaining popularity in order to make better sense of what Mill is getting at in this piece and why he makes some of the comments that he makes. Because he is opposed to this view. Does anybody have any questions so far? Okay, let's jump into now what Mill says utilitarianism is and why it matters. Can anybody tell me what utilitarianism is? Does anybody remember from the reading? What does it say makes an action moral or immoral? Anybody know? Anybody take a guess? Yes.
Isn't it whenever the consequences are like good for mostly everyone?
Exactly. Yeah. Whereas Kant says the morality of an action can be determined before anybody even does the action. The utilitarians are going to say, no, that's ass backwards. Okay? The morality of an action is determined by the consequences of the action. Utilitarianism is a more specific philosophy within the theory of consequentialism. Consequentialism is the view that the morality of an action is determined by its consequences. Now, this view, of course, doesn't tell us which consequences we should be seeking after, right? You could say to someone, well, you know, the morality of your action is determined by its consequences. They can just turn around and say, okay, what consequences then, right? Maybe my personal moral theory is whatever action gets the most cake in my hands, that's a moral action, right? That would be an example of a consequentialist view. But I doubt that people would say that that is actually a convincing moral theory, right? So consequentialism states that the morality of an action is determined by its consequences. A type of consequentialist theory, one type, is utilitarianism, which is what Mill believes in. The utilitarians believe that the consequences of an action determine whether it's moral or immoral, but then they go further and they tell us what consequences specifically we're looking for if we want to be moral, if we want to do moral things. To quote John Stuart Mill, utilitarianism is the view that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong in proportion as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness or suffering. And I'll explain what this is here after I write it out. So the way Mill understands what makes an action moral or immoral is he says it's determined by the consequences, but the specific consequences that we're looking at are whether or not those actions produce happiness or suffering. And by happiness, what he tends to mean is pleasure and absence of pain. So, moral actions are actions that produce net happiness in the universe. Immoral actions produce net suffering. So the utilitarian's primary goal, the thing they think that makes an action moral or immoral, is whether that action maximizes happiness in the universe. There you go, a little bit of abbreviation for you. Do you all find this view intuitive? Does it make sense? What do you think? What do you all think about this view? Anyone? Bueller? No. Are you too young? Do you not know that joke? Does this seem intuitive? Does this make sense? Is this common sense?
Yeah, I mean, I get it at least somewhat.
Is this how you live your life? Are you thinking, am I going to hurt someone by this action, or am I going to make them happy? Is that primarily how you think about what to do?
Mm-hmm.
What about the rest of you? Do you like this view better than Kant's view? Yeah. Yeah, you do. Okay, why?
Because I feel as though that if you can try to make more people happy than yourself, that's better than just trying to make yourself happy.
You bring up an important point. This is something to keep in mind with this view. What the utilitarian is trying to do is they're trying to maximize happiness in the universe. Therefore, what they're going to do when they're trying to decide what to do in their life is they're going to try to consider how their actions are going to impact everybody's welfare, not just their own person. Do you all like that idea? Considering everybody's well-being in your actions? Does that sound nice? There are two main types of utilitarianism that we should discuss, and that Mill actually brings up in this essay, although I'm not sure if he does it explicitly. There are a few different ways to go about this. How do you maximize happiness in the universe? Well, one way is to kind of latch on to those general rules that tend to produce the best results. This is known as rule utilitarianism. And I'm going to abbreviate it again because I'm lazy. Rule utilitarianism is the view that we ought to perform those actions that, in general, most of the time, produce the most happiness. What's the word I use? Perform. sometimes when you read philosophy that's about utilitarianism, they'll use this word utility instead of happiness. And what they mean by utility is not just whether something is practical or not, but what they mean is something producing the most utility is something that is producing the best state of affairs. Oftentimes, utilitarians, in order to give their arguments and argue whether actions are moral or immoral, will try to quantify the effects of actions on people. They'll try to quantify it. And so they'll use a term of measurement that's known as utiles. How much utility is produced by the action in question? For our purposes today, we can take Mill as basically saying, whatever produces the most happiness is what's good and what we ought to do. So this view basically says, look, we've been around for a long time. We've been interacting with each other for a long time. We kind of know now how our actions generally impact people. We kind of know what rules are good rules to follow. We kind of know what rules are not so good. And so this view is one that encourages us to follow those general rules that we've learned produce the most consequences, the best consequences. So the rule utilitarian will say, look, sometimes transgressing someone's rights ends up producing a better state of affairs. If we have a serial killer and we know that they're going to kill again and they're being put on trial and we're pretty convinced that they're going to get off because they have a good lawyer and they're going to kill again, we still have to respect their right to due process because we've discovered that generally respecting rights normally produces the best state of affairs for people. Or, normally, if your partner approaches you and you interact with them, you want to be honest. Like being honest in a relationship is normally what produces the best consequences, keeps things smoothed over. So if they come to you with clothing on and they ask, do I look fat? The rule utilitarian will say, even if they do look fat and you want to save them the hurt, you still be honest with them. Because generally being honest is what's going to produce the best results. Does this view make sense? It says, follow the general rules that tend to produce the best results. We can contrast this view with act utilitarianism, which is much more context dependent. Act utilitarianism says, no, screw that. Okay, if what we're after is maximizing the amount of happiness in the universe, we need to look at each specific circumstance, each context, and do the thing that's going to produce the best net positive result. Doesn't matter if we have to transgress someone's rights. Doesn't matter if we have to lie to our girlfriends. You do the thing that produces the most net happiness. So it says we ought to perform those actions that will produce the most utility in that specific situation. Because of this, act utilitarianism is more context dependent than rule utilitarianism. So the act utilitarian will say, look, all right, we have a serial killer. We know he's going to kill again. It looks like he's going to get off because he has a good lawyer. The moral thing to do is to probably not give him due process. Throw him in jail or kill him in the back alley. All right, that's going to produce the best consequences. It's going to prevent him from killing people. It's going to make people happy. Screw his rights. Okay? Or, if your significant other approaches you and they ask you, do I look fat? And lying is going to produce the best result. It's going to make you both happy. Then you got to lie. You got to say, you look beautiful. You look amazing. Do you all understand the difference between these two views? This one is more general, right? It's going to say, follow the general rules that tend to produce the best results. Act utilitarianism is going to say, no, you need to look at each factor in this situation, and you need to do that thing that's going to produce the best results, the most happiness. Even if that involves lying or killing someone. Let's take another example just to differentiate between these. You're a doctor in a hospital. A healthy person arrives for a normal checkup. It just so happens that you have 5 people in the ICU that need a bunch of organs replaced, and this one person is a match for all of them. And you could slice this healthy person open, and you could save these 5 people. Replace their organs with that person's healthy organs. The real utilitarian is going to say, no, in general, slicing open healthy people without their consent is not a good thing. All right, so we can't do that. The act utilitarian is going to say, nope, got to slice that guy open. Kill 1 to save 5. Screw his rights, screw his consent. That's going to produce the best result in this instance. Does that make sense? Which one of these views do you like better? Are you all about maximizing happiness, or do you tend to follow general rules, even if it doesn't always produce the best result? What do you all think? Maybe you don't live your life like this at all. I don't know. Yeah.
I feel like rule utilitarianism is better for like bigger issues.
Like what?
Like when you were talking about how the serial killer still deserves due process, but then like for act utilitarianism, I feel like for smaller things like telling your girlfriend that she looks beautiful even if you're lying, I feel like that's better.
Okay, so you kind of want to flip-flop between them, maybe, depending on the... Is that how everybody else feels? It seems like if you want to flip-flop, then what you really believe in is this, right? Or you prioritize that. Because you're like, look, I'll give this up in some instances, right? This is a higher order thing that I'm following. Does anybody have any problems with utilitarianism? Can this go wrong? Do you not like it? Do you like Kant's view better? Yeah.
I don't really know, because I feel like if you truly follow utilitarianism, what is to say that you're not going to put minorities at risk? Like if there's a group of people and net happiness is the people that are not nice, then like who's to stop bad things from happening?
Right. That's a great point. Remember, the utilitarian wants to maximize the amount of happiness in the universe. What that means is putting the good of the many over the good of the few. If you have to kill 1 person to save 5, you kill that individual. If, for example, in the US, a policy is going to produce more happiness and it's going to disadvantage minorities because there are more white people in the US, then you got to do that policy. We're looking for the consequences that produce the most amount of happiness. So there are instances in which, the individual is going to be thrown to the side for the majority. Minorities may be thrown to the side in preference for other social groups whose, if you treat them right, it'll maximize happiness. And that doesn't sound very nice, right? Is there a better way to do things, though? The utilitarian is out here, and they're just like, look, we're maximizing happiness. You can talk about your intentions all you want, but, if you intended to do a good thing and you killed someone, you did a bad thing. Okay? It doesn't matter what your intention was. But let's keep going on with what Mill has to say, because he has reasons for supporting this view over Kant's view. And it has to do with the way that he conceives of organisms generally, and more specifically humans. Why do we do what we do? What is the fundamental underlying motivation of everything that we do in life? What do you think? Mill has a view on this. Any ideas? Maybe think biologically or think evolutionarily. What are all organisms trying to do? What are they trying to reach? What's their goal? Is it to feel like crap? Do all organisms want to feel like crap? No, right? What is everybody seeking in their life? Happiness. Right. Mill thinks that pleasure and prevention of pain, that is the underlying motivation for everything that we do. That's why we do what we do. And it's really clear that this is true, he thinks, if you just look at animals, right? Animals don't do things that make them feel pain or that make them suffer. They do things that make them feel good, that give them pleasure, right? They have sex, they eat food, they snuggle up on a warm bed, right? They're not snuggling up outside in the rain under the tree, right? Unless they don't live inside, but Mill says, he believes, that pleasure and prevention of pain is the underlying motivation for all living things. What we're seeking for in this life is happiness. We want to be happy. We want to have a pleasurable life. Oh. This is why he argues so vigorously for utilitarianism. It lines up right with the view that the morality of an action is determined by whether that action produces net happiness. Because this is what we're all after. We all want to establish a state of affairs in which we're happy, ideally in which everyone else is happy, right? This is what we're all trying to do. So naturally, whether an action is moral or immoral is whether or not it reaches this end. Whether or not it establishes more happiness than we had previously. And just to reiterate, I want to make it clear that the utilitarian is trying to maximize happiness in the universe. Therefore, the morality of an action is going to be determined by its consequences for everyone, how that action impacts the entire universe or the entire world, not just the person doing it. So, if you buy a pair of sneakers that were made in Thailand, and you get some pleasure out of your new Nike pair of sneakers, but you end up making somebody else's life a living hell because they have to work in terrible conditions, they're not getting paid, they don't get good sleep. The utilitarian is going to say, if you produced more suffering than the happiness that you got, you did an immoral thing. Does that make sense? So it doesn't matter just the effect your actions have on you. The morality of an action is determined by how the consequences affect everyone. Whether or not the consequences produce more happiness or more suffering. And we do that by tallying up kind of the state people are in after you do the action compared to what would have happened if you did something else. Right? We see, okay, Jim Bob is up 3 pleasure points from that action. Charlene is down -2. Okay, we're at 1. Tally it up across the board for everybody that's impacted by the action. And if you have a net positive happiness that's produced, you did a good thing. Net negative happiness, net suffering, if you produce suffering, bad thing. Make sense? Now, I've been using this word pleasure a lot. Well, Mill uses it, but I've been using it too. What do you think he means by pleasure? If our goal is to maximize pleasure, to maximize happiness in the universe, is he saying that life is all about popping X in the club? Having orgies with your friends? What do you think? Is it that crude? Is that what a moral life is all about? Is pleasure? Eating good burgers? Shooting up in the bathroom? What do you think he's going to say? Yeah.
I feel like it's not making yourself or other people as happy as they possibly can be in their whole life. I feel like it's more like making them content where they are.
Okay. So, not all actions that produce pleasure are like the best actions you could do. Like maybe, the first time you try heroin feels really great, but it's not going to lead to a good life for you and others. So you shouldn't do it, maybe? Yeah.
I think he's thinking more along the lines of like long-term pleasure, where like probably feeling satisfied from like accomplishing a great feat, something like that.
Exactly. Mill is not saying life is all about hookers and blow. Okay? He makes a distinction between what are called higher pleasures and lower pleasures. Because when we're trying to determine the morality of an action, quality and quantity of pleasure matters. I don't even know how to write a cue anymore. So when we're trying to determine whether an action is moral or immoral, we look at the kind of pleasure or the kind of happiness the action produces and how much it produces. Mill is going to argue that there are these things called higher pleasures that are more satisfying and better than lower pleasures. Lower pleasures are what we are capable of experiencing sensuously with our five senses. A lower pleasure would be smoking crack, or maybe getting a good night's sleep, having really good sex, eating really good food. Stuff that appeals kind of to our lower sensory ways of obtaining pleasure on earth. We share this with animals. Animals and humans are capable of having lower pleasures. And these pleasures, again, have to do with the senses, with like physical things, food, sex, base comforts, etc. Those pleasures are good. We want to feel those pleasures, but they're not the end-all be-all. And they're not the pleasures that we should ultimately be seeking after or trying to produce in the universe. Animals are capable only of these lower pleasures. What's special about humans is that we are also capable of having higher pleasures, of acquiring higher pleasures. If food, sex, drugs, if these are lower pleasures, what do you think higher pleasures are? What can humans obtain that animals can't, that makes them happy? Winning a championship. Playing a really great chess game. Enjoying an amazing book. Feeling a sense of accomplishment. Admiring beauty and artwork. Mental satisfaction. Mental and spiritual satisfaction is what the higher pleasures are couched in. Those are the things that are better and that we should prioritize higher than the lower pleasures, are the pleasures that give us mental and spiritual satisfaction. While we are capable of both higher pleasures and lower pleasures, ultimately moral actions will be the ones that prioritize the producing of higher pleasures. Not just, food and sex and drugs, but accomplishment, fulfillment, mental and spiritual satisfaction. Sorry, this marker is kind of not the best. Because in our lives, right, we're not just looking to have these lower pleasures, right? You seem to want something more out of your life than just eating a good burger every day, or just having good sex every day, or just, snorting something every day. You want to feel fulfilled, right? You want to feel like your life has meaning. You want to feel mentally satisfied, not just physically satisfied, right? And so we can kind of lump in this category of higher pleasures like knowledge, love, meaning, experiencing beauty, things that animals are not capable of doing, right? Your dog can't experience mental satisfaction from looking at a Picasso, right? Your snake can't appreciate Tchaikovsky. But we are. We are capable of doing that. And we're more satisfied and happier by doing those things. Now, it's really cool that we're able to do that. It's really cool that we're able to obtain pleasures that mentally and spiritually satisfy us. But the fact that we have the capacity to do that is a double-edged sword. Does anybody know why? The fact that we're capable of having these higher pleasures means that we're also capable of not having them. The extent to which we can find pleasure in things higher than just lower pleasures also makes us able to experience acute forms of suffering that animals do not. If your dog has a girlfriend, your dog's life is not going to be crushed if she stops coming around. Humans can get pretty messed up, though, if they break up with someone in a certain circumstance. Because we're capable of feeling these higher pleasures, we are also capable to forms of suffering that animals are not. We see ugliness in the world. Animals do not. We can imagine our futures. We can compare our present to where we want to be, and we can feel dissatisfied knowing we're not all we could be, knowing that the world is not the way we want it to be, knowing that our future is bleak. Animals don't have any of that suffering. Okay? Animals are just living moment to moment, experiencing what comes. But we can project forwards in time, backwards in time. Our life could be sufferable because we don't have the higher pleasures in it in ways that animals' lives are not sufferable. Does that make sense? We can feel existential and spiritual anguish and despair about our mortality, the fact that we're all going to die, about the fact that everybody we love is probably going to die. Animals ain't worried about that. They don't suffer like that. So this capacity to feel these higher pleasures is a double-edged sword because it opens us up to new and different, and you might say more harmful ways of suffering. In spite of that, Mill makes what you might think is a very surprising claim. And I'd like to discuss this with you now, because I think it's interesting. He says, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. He thinks these higher pleasures are so great that they're so fulfilling that even a not great human life is more desirable than that being a happy animal, that being a happy pig, a happy dog, a happy cat. What do you think about that? Do you agree with him? Would you rather be you than a dog living in a rich person's home? Yeah? What, do you want to tell us why?
I mean, I just feel like that wouldn't be too fun. You're just chilling in a big house all the time. Like, I don't know. You have no, like, it's not that you don't have purpose, but you don't really have anything to look forward to in life. Like,
It's not like you could look forward to anything, right? If you're a dog,
Yeah,
right? You're just doing dog stuff.
you're going to grow up in the house, and then you're going to die in the house, and it'll be over.
But you're going to be loved. You'll never have to worry about food. You'll get pets. You'll be a good boy or a good girl, you know? Doesn't that sound desirable? Is it more desirable than being you right now? Or would you rather be you? What do you think? Share your opinions with me. Yeah, Seton.
Sometimes whenever I'm like overwhelmed with schoolwork, I'll like look at my cat and be like, oh, she doesn't have to do any of this, and I like get jealous. So I kind of know. Like I don't know if I like initially agree with that quote.
Yeah. I look at my cat and I think, man, you have a good life. I love you. I don't disrespect you. I pet you. You're very needy, so I pet you a lot. She's living a rockin' life. She doesn't have to worry about, being killed by other cats out in the alley or giant birds swooping down. But I don't know if I would rather be in her place than mine.
I think that, like, while we think that animals have like an easier life with that, I think it also lacks substance because they can't appreciate the wealth of knowledge that you've gained as a human or appreciate like actual love and loss, because like I think that's the beauty of life, is when we appreciate those complex feelings.
Wonderful. You bring up a great point. Humans have the capacity to experience truly the depth of life. Right? Life is deep for us in many ways. And I don't mean to sound cliche. There is literal depth to everything. Our emotional experience is crazy complex. The meaning that we can draw from the world can be extremely fulfilling and motivating. We're capable of doing amazing things. We have a freedom that animals do not. Right? We can change ourselves in ways that animals cannot if we don't like who we are. We get to experience friendship, art, beauty, Arctic monkeys. Animals can't appreciate or feel that stuff, right? But I guess the question turns on whether or not you think higher or lower pleasures are more desirable, right? Maybe you don't care about art. Maybe you're like, music, lame, whatever. You just want the sex and the drugs and the rock and roll and the good food. Is there anybody who's kind of leaning towards that? They're like, yeah, books never satisfied me. Art has never been top my priority list. Friendships, who really needs them? I got one best friend, that's fine. Anybody leaning towards that? The life of lower pleasures? Maybe you'd be more convinced then to being a satisfied pig. Yeah.
I also feel like he's not giving enough credit to animals, because I feel like some of them can experience the higher pleasures as well. And I also feel like it's more of a survival tactic for them. And what if we were taught to experience those higher pleasures as a survival tactic for us as well? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe he's wrong about the extent to which animals, have the same or have a similar way of life and way of perceiving the world that we do. You know, maybe he's really pushing animals lower than they really are, and their capacity for feeling and their capacity for pleasure lower than they really are. Let's vote. Who would rather be a pig satisfied? Raise your hand. We have any takers? We have a few takers. All right, human being dissatisfied. Does your answer change if you know your life is never going to get better than this? Yeah. Hopefully y'all are not living terrible lives, but I'm not so sure I want to be a pig satisfied. But maybe that's because I know what it's like to be a human and I don't want to give it up. Does anybody else feel that way? Like we've experienced all of this stuff, right? We've fallen in love. We've listened to Beethoven, right? We've seen great works of art. We've cried, we've laughed. Maybe we don't want to give that up. But maybe if we hadn't ever known that, maybe we would want to be a pig. It's tough to say. In any case, let's continue on with what Mill has to say. Because he says a lot more in this article, and I'm not going to discuss all of it. But what I'd like to do is briefly go over how he thinks we can get people to be utilitarians. And then I'd like to end class by discussing maybe some problems with utilitarianism. Just like we started out at the beginning of the class by talking about problems with Kant's view. Mill says, look, the world would be a lot better place if everybody considered everybody's welfare before they decide to do what they do. Now, it's all fine and dandy to know what the moral thing is, to try to live that way yourself, but the world ain't going to get better until people start changing how they act. Right? So a sizable portion near the end of this article is him discussing, well, how do we normalize utilitarianism? How do we get people to follow it? How do we convince people that it's the right thing to do? How do we make it a larger part of the way that people think and act so that the world can become a better place? He says we have to give people the proper incentives. Incentives are what's going to convince or influence people to follow utilitarianism. He makes a distinction between two kinds of incentives, what he calls external sanctions and internal sanctions. Of course, one way of getting people to follow utilitarianism has to do with dishing out rewards and punishments for people's actions. If somebody does a bad thing, you'll change their behavior if you punish them for what they did. Maybe they'll think differently in the future, right? So governments and institutions and we as members of society can use rewards and punishments to get people to follow utilitarianism. These are external sanctions. Sanctions placed on people from without. But there are also internal sanctions. We can convince people to follow utilitarianism just by exposing them to certain things to stir up certain emotions within them, by reminding them of what their goals are, of what they want the world to be, by generating sympathy and empathy within them. These are known as internal sanctions. Things that bubble up within the individual person that is going to get them to think and act differently. Reminding people they have a devotion to their fellow person. Showing people how horrific crime can be. how terrible the world can be can cause people to say, oh man, that's really bad. Like, that makes me feel lots of things. I don't want the world to be like that. I'll change. He thinks reminding people that they have a devotion to God might be a good internal sanction to cause them to change their behavior towards more utilitarian ways of doing things. Or getting people to sympathize or empathize with others. That's one way. Internal and external sanctions are one way of influencing people's behavior. There's also education, which he thinks is really important. If we want to change the world, we need to educate people differently. And so he says we need to teach society to conceive of their own happiness as being integrated with everybody else's. We don't live in a vacuum. Our actions have consequences. Other people's actions have consequences. How other people feel is inevitably going to affect us. And how we feel is inevitably going to affect them. So he says we need to convince people that their happiness is bound up with everybody else's happiness. If people just conceive of themselves as saying, my happiness has nothing to do with anybody else's, the world ain't going to change. In this way, utilitarianism is kind of a collectivist ethical theory. Because it's focusing on maximizing happiness, which, in practical terms, usually results in producing the most amount of happiness in the most amount of people. But not always. He says we need to teach people to place the interests of the group, of the majority, of society, over the individual. So we may need to convince people to, sacrifice their own individual interests for the group, for the general welfare of society. And he says if we're going to change the world, if we're going to make people more utilitarian, we need to try to eliminate social inequalities. Because as long as there are social inequalities between people, people might not have the incentive to be better. They might not have the incentive to think and act differently. And if there are social inequalities, there are going to be people who are going to be resentful and jealous of the people who have more than them, which is just going to stir up bad things. So we need to eliminate social inequalities as well. Or teach people how to do that. Now, I've just given you this lecture about utilitarianism, all about maximizing happiness. What problems can you see with it, if any? Is it airtight? You like it better than Kant's view? Does it just knock Kant's view out of the water? Does anybody see any potential problems with this view? Yes?
I see the potential problem will probably be if one man can persuade a very vast majority of people to think ill, then that could be a problem.
If someone had a sort of influence over other people's psychology, then, well, there are two interesting things to think about there. One is, if somebody did have that kind of influence, they could change the world as they see fit, right? Which could be bad. But there's kind of a more fundamental conceptual problem. Think about this. If what makes us happy depends on what we think, if you had the ability to change a lot of people's minds about things, all of a sudden you would change what the moral or immoral action is. Because what the consequences are for you are going to be downstream of how you think about it. Right? So the fundamental problem is, does morality change like that? Is the morality of an action determined by what people think about it? By how people think it's going to impact them? Does what's right or wrong ever change? Is it eternal? Is there a fact of the matter about what's right and what's wrong that always holds forever? It's a deep question. How about this? Can we ever definitively determine what the consequences of our actions will be? Utilitarianism says, right, the morality of an action is determined by its consequences. Can we actually determine ahead of time what the consequences of our actions will be? And is it possible to ever actually fully determine if an action was ever moral or immoral? I'll tell you what I mean by that in a second. There are two questions here. One question is, can we know with a reasonable amount of certainty how our actions will impact others? Mill says we can. He's like, look, we've been around for a long time. We've been doing stuff for a long time. We generally know how our actions are going to impact others. So therefore, we can know whether the action is going to be moral or immoral. But there's a more deeper problem here too, which is, how do you determine what the consequences of an action are? Think about it like this. You're in your dorm room. You're doing your homework. You submit your homework assignment, but you submit it late. That ends up causing your teacher to be upset. Your teacher being upset ends up causing him to be mean to his wife. She being upset ends up making a mistake at work that costs the company money. The company goes under because of the grievous mistake. They can no longer do charities for people. A bunch of people die. A bunch of people in that country die, but that ends up producing a revolution in which the people make the country richer and they make things better because they see all the horrors that's going on. Where do the consequences of an action stop? You see what I mean? Your sending in your homework assignment late caused all of these things to happen, and that's going to produce more consequences into the future. The consequences never stop. This is what Hannah Arendt calls the process character of action. By acting, we initiate processes that we cannot foresee or completely know, and processes that never end. If that's the case, where can we draw the line and say, yup, A, B, and C, these are the consequences we're considering, but then what do you do about D, E, F, G? You see the problem? Where do we draw the line? Does it ever make sense, ultimately, to draw a line anywhere? Because our consequences are just going to produce more consequences, right? Or how about this? Do only the consequences of our actions matter? Is that the end-all, be-all? What matters more, the intention of the person or the consequence of their action? If you're like me and if you're like other people, you want to say that both matter, right? But Kant's view and the view of utilitarianism, they say only one of those matters. But that doesn't seem intuitively right. Right? We also want people's intentions to play a role. Or we seem to regard people's intentions as important. right? If somebody rear ends you and they didn't intend to do that, you don't think they're a bad person. You're like, oh, it's an accident. Accidents happen. I get it. Let me give you one more problem, and then I'll let you go. This is what is known as the utility monster thought experiment. Utilitarians want to maximize happiness, right? Now, for human beings, it's not too difficult to determine which, if you don't, buy into this first problem. It's pretty easy to determine how your consequences are going to impact someone, right? And there's only a certain amount of pleasure or happiness that a person can feel. Take eating pizza as an example. The first piece of pizza you eat is great. The second, a little less great. The 12th, you don't want to eat pizza anymore, all right? You're sick. There is a limit to the amount of pleasure that we can feel. And when we do pleasurable things, we experience diminishing returns if we keep doing them, right? This is why people develop drug addictions, intolerance. They experience diminishing returns from doing the drug, right? They're always chasing that first high and they can never get back to it because successive use doesn't feel as good. Imagine a scenario in which there is a thing that exists in our universe called a utility monster. We could imagine this as a sufficiently complex AI maybe in the future that can experience emotions like us, but has no cap to the amount of pleasure that they can feel. If it's true that such a utility monster exists, that you could give them all the food and the sex and the mental satisfaction in the world and they never get tired of it and they keep experiencing more and more pleasure, utilitarianism would say the moral thing to do is to give everything in the universe to this thing, because that's going to maximize happiness. Kind of a weird consequence of the view, right? Does this make anybody think there's a problem with utilitarianism? Or maybe you're thinking utility monsters don't exist, we don't have to worry about that problem. Anybody think that? What if I said God is a utility monster? Is there a limit to the amount of satisfaction God can get from your praises or how you live your life? I don't think so. I don't know. So I guess if you're a religious person and you're a utilitarian, you got to give everything to God. I mean, it's his to begin with, right? So maybe that doesn't matter, but it's an interesting consequence, right? All right. I can see you all want to go. I'll let you go. I hope I've given you something to think about. I hope you found this interesting. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to email me, okay? All right. Have a good week, everyone.